Hi and welcome. In this lecture we will discuss how a gear shift strategy can be represented as gear shift borders in a force speed diagram. Then we study what happens if the same gear shift strategy is applied in two different cases. First with low acceleration at low traction force, and then in the second case with acceleration at maximum traction force. A gear shift strategy can be described in a force speed diagram by borders that when they are crossed tell the gear shift control to shift up, or when they are crossed the other way tell the gear control to shift down. If we also include in the strategy to select the gear that maximizes the engine torque, the strategy looks like in this figure. This strategy will lead to a very low fuel consumption, although not always the theoretically lowest. If you think this looks exactly as the overlaid operating ranges for the 5 gears we have studied before, you are right. However, for gear shifting purposes, the figure should be interpreted in a slightly different way. Here we don't focus that much on the overlapping operating range, but rather the borders between the colored regions. Again, when the operating point of the powertrain moves over a border, a gear shift will occur. If the operating point passes from the border between the yellow and the orange region, the gear shall shift from first to second. If it passes the same border but in the opposite direction, the gear shall shift down from second to first. If instead the operating point moves from the orange to the light red region, the gear shall shift from second to third, and similarly for the borders for the 4th and the 5th gear. Notice that it is important in what order the operating ranges were plotted in the diagram. In this version they are plotted from the 1st to the 5th, meaning that the operating range of a gear with higher number always ends up on top of the operating range for a lower gear. That corresponds to a strategy where the highest of the possible gears are always used, which translates to aiming for the highest possible engine torque in all situations. It's common in gear shift software to express the gear shift control as a function of accelerator pedal position and the vehicle speed, and not of traction force and vehicle speed as in this diagram. However, since the accelerator pedal position is used to control the traction force, both these methods can be used. A gear shift program expressed in traction force and vehicle speed is the preferred method in this course, since it can be interpreted more easily without having to know how the accelerator pedal position translates into traction force request. Now we have zoomed in on the force speed diagram to better see the details. Real gear shift strategies have different borders for determining when to shift up compared with the borders used for determining when to shift down. They are placed with a hysteresis in both speed and traction force. The reason is that we want to avoid that a small variation back and forth in the vehicle speed or in how much the driver pressed the accelerator pedal will lead to the gearbox repeatedly cycling between two gears. The gear shift borders does not have to be at the borders of the operating range of a gear, but they of course must be placed inside or at the border of the operating range. As an example, we can look at this border for shifting up from gear 4 to gear 5. This is well inside the operating range on gear 5, and it means that the gear does not change to gear 5 directly as the operating point moves into the light blue region. This is an example of a border for shifting back to gear 4. Notice that it is separated from the other border to avoid cycling between gears. It is also close to the border of the light blue region, that is the operating range on gear 5. This makes the gearbox favor the 5th gear, so to speak, and avoid switching to a lower gear unless it's really needed. Now let us look at an example of how the gear will be shifted with these borders. We assume that we start in this operating point in gear 4. The speed increases, but the gearbox stays in gear 4 all the way up to this speed. Here the 5th gear is selected. The gearbox stays in gear 5 as long as the outer border is not passed. Assume the vehicle reaches a small gradient and the driver requests more traction force. If more force than this is required, the gear shifts down to fourth gear. The gear then stays in gear 4 as long as the operating point does not pass the border for upshift, even if the operating point is clearly within the possible operating range of gear 5. Notice that the gearbox did not shift back to fifth gear in this case. Even though the hysteresis is important for a comfortable gear shifting in a real car, we will opt out of the possibility to design with hysteresis most of the time in this course, since it is not critical for our purposes. Also, including hysteresis makes more complicated gear shift controllers. So, let's keep it simple and use a gear shifting strategy with just 5 regions in the force speed diagram. When the operating point is within the yellow region, first gear is selected. In the orange, the second gear is selected, and so on. These regions can perfectly match the operating ranges of the gear, like in this figure, or they can be smaller than the possible operating range on each gear. Now we will go through 2 different driving cycles and explain how this gear shift control works. First, we will analyze a simple case in which the vehicle slowly increases its speed with very low acceleration. This case shows what gear will be used when driving in different speeds without any significant acceleration. We start at standstill on first gear, add a small force. Then the speed increases slowly. When the vehicle reaches 20 km per hour, the second gear is selected. The speed increases further, and with that the engine speed. As soon as it is possible to switch to the third gear without getting a too low engine speed, third gear is selected. The fourth gear is also selected as soon as possible, and so is the fifth. Then the remaining acceleration is on the fifth gear, as there is no higher gear. After a short time, the driver wants the vehicle to decelerate without applying any braking. Therefore, the accelerator pedal is released such that the traction force becomes 0. Now there is no traction force on a flat road, so the vehicle will slow down due to rolling and aerodynamic resistance. The speed decreases, and when it reaches 50 km per hour, the gearbox shifts down to fourth gear to avoid a too low engine speed. Okay, that is how the gear shift control responds in situation with rather low traction force. As long as the force is within this region, the gear is controlled only based on vehicle speed. An upshift occurs as soon as it is possible without getting a too low engine speed, and a downshift does not occur until the engine speed is back at its minimum speed. Now we will look at how the same gear shift strategy responds to another driving cycle. In this case, the driver pressed the accelerator pedal fully in order to accelerate as quickly as possible to 150 km per hour and then keep that speed constant at 150. The vehicle starts at standstill. It starts on first gear and initially needs to slip the clutch. When the vehicle speed is sufficiently high, about 10 km per hour, the clutch can be closed fully. The engine control will use the maximum force possible on first gear. Since the force is high, the vehicle will accelerate quickly. When the speed is about 70, the engine reaches its maximum speed. To be able to continue to accelerate, the second gear is selected. On the second gear, the maximum traction force is lower than on first gear. The vehicle continues to accelerate, but now with a lower acceleration due to the lower traction force. Then the engine reaches its maximum speed again and needs to shift to third gear, on which it continues to accelerate up to 150. When the desired speed is reached, the driver releases the accelerator pedal such that the acceleration stops. Since the driver requests much less traction force, the gearbox control selects the fifth gear. Notice that the same gear shift strategy in the first case with very low traction force used the high gears as soon as it was possible, while it in this second case with maximum acceleration It instead stayed on the low gears as long as it could to maximize the traction force. In this lecture, we have seen how a gear shift strategy can be illustrated in a force-speed diagram. The diagram has one region per gear, and whenever the operating point is within that region, that gear is selected. The illustrated gear shift strategy is aiming at low fuel consumption. The borders between the different gear regions will be different if other criteria are included in the gear shift strategy. Thank you for watching and welcome to practice what you have learned about gear shift strategies.